Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Aarushi Gupta, and I'm here to present our paper called Beyond Semantics, where we examine gender bias, particularly in large language model-based applications deployed in critical social sectors like healthcare, agriculture, specifically in low-resource contexts, such as India. And this was co-authored by my colleague, Dr. Urvashi Aneja at Digital Futures Lab, as well as Dr. Aditya Vashistha at Cornell University. Now, very quickly, just to set some context, we began this work back in 2023, where chat GPTs and LLMs were really bursting on the scene. So a conversation around gender biases was there in popular discourse, but it was very much oriented towards Western English language context. Nobody was really talking about what happens when LLMs are deployed amongst low-income, non-English speaking marginalized populations, especially for high-stakes sectors, right? For instance, LLM chatbots that are dispensing information around parenting, around sexual reproductive healthcare and agriculture to women, particularly, especially in local languages, right? Sorry. Okay, so very quickly, what we tried to do is we looked at two core questions. One is, of course, to understand the sources and manifestations of gender bias in some of these applications, but also try to situate the discussion and connect it to the larger ICT 4D and gender discourse, because we saw that there was a clear disconnect. We were talking about and rehashing a lot of the things where scholars have already spoken about what happens when ICT 4D or really techno-solutionist framings are used within such sectors. And we did this through a medley of methods. Now, since we did this through a medley of methods, since the space was very nascent, we relied very much on LLM developers themselves to really tell us about the kind of process they're using to build these applications, what kind of gender-related concerns have emerged. We also complemented the interviews with field visits where we visited deployment sites as well as user testing sites where some of these LLM chatbots were being tested. And lastly, we also did a few prompting exercises, particularly with users, female participants who belonged to underserved communities in India. And all of this was done with a focus on Indian languages per se, which of course remained underrepresented at that time within AI bias research. Now, and these are of course some of the images from those field visits and workshops. Now, diving straight into the findings, I'll first start with really the main underpinnings of the paper, which is that when we talked about gender bias, usually what we saw in the existing scholarship, it was more about semantics. It was more about how certain words were used in LLM outputs that represented gender, denigration, stereotypes, etc. But we saw that if we were to talk about gender bias in the Indian context, where inequality, gender violence, gender inequity in general is an everyday reality, we can't really stop ourselves at just semantics. He's a doctor, she's a nurse. We also need to situate it within the larger structural realities of the day and age. And what we did is we deconstructed gender bias. We, of course, looked at it from the content-based angle, which is stereotypes, but we also introduced three new boxes, which is to say that LLMs can be categorized as gender biased if they are not relevant for women users to begin with, for use cases such as agriculture, where the target audience should be both male and women farmers. But if an LLM chatbot is designed keeping a male archetypal user in mind and not really training it on women's information needs, it really isn't relevant and can be categorized as biased. And the other aspects were around accessibility. And this is, of course, conventional wisdom that LLMs were then inherently biased against women, because we know that within India there is a lot of digital divide, and women struggled to not just access devices on which the LLMs were hosted, but also just the very text-based modality of it made it very less amenable to women from using these chatbots. And we also had a risk-based perspective in terms of there are LLMs which might pose higher risk for women users compared to male users, right? So keeping this expanded sort of taxonomy in mind, we mapped the various sources of gender bias across the life cycle of the LLM application. Now, this is very much an organizing framework. It just helped us neatly arrange our findings. And I can quickly actually start with the second stage, actually, which is data collection stage. And of course, a lot of this is covered adequately in NLP research in terms of how gender bias can be source can be traced back to the data itself. But when we talk about data representation and we started talking to organizations, we realized that this representation issue manifests in very subtle forms. So take the example of an agriculture chatbot. We saw that women farmers, since they have been excluded from formal agriculture advisory systems, they often might not have the terminology or the formal terms to, let's say, define a pesticide or a fertilizer. They might resort to visual cues, such as, so for instance, to refer to like a yellow packaged pesticide, they might just describe it like that, compared to male farmers who are more likely to use chemical compound names, brand names, for instance. And if the rack data that you're using to sort of customize a pre-trained model, such as GPT or Llama, if you haven't trained it on some of these linguistic nuances, the model or the chatbot really doesn't cater to female farmers, right? Very quickly, I'm going to skip some of the word embeddings related biases or translation in detail per se for this presentation, but we saw something quite interesting in some of our field visits and realized how difficult it is to make a contextually relevant model for female farmers, especially those who want to use it in a local language. So during the testing of the sexual reproductive healthcare chatbot, we saw that the terminologies for, let's say, abortion and miscarriage are the same. So the chatbot kept getting confused whether the woman who's asking the question is really reporting a miscarriage or is it talking about a potential abortion, right? And these were some of the nuances that we haven't seen documented in existing NLP gender bias research. Very quickly moving on to the evaluation stage. Of course, throughout the interviews with LLM developers, we saw that there is a race towards creating a minimum viable product. At least that was the case in 2023, 24. Issues around biases and perhaps environmental sustainability were almost second order, right? And of course, during the evaluation, when we discussed what was the criteria for evaluating a chatbot, most of it was around accuracy, tonality of the model, perhaps contextual relevance, but nobody was really assessing gender biases in their chatbot. And it wasn't just about the omission of the criteria. It was also about, let's say, if during my testing, I am looking at ease of comprehension of the chatbot's outputs, we saw very few developers using a gendered lens because we know ease of comprehension also differs across women and male users, but that kind of a gender lens was not really used. And this is something that I covered quite briefly earlier, which is that a lot of these, there's one slide missing, but it was basically a chatbot interface with a lot of text-heavy outputs where, so for instance, in case I asked the chatbot about something around using contraception pills, we saw that some of these applications really churned out essays in the form of history of contraceptives, the science, how they work, but very little around contextualized outputs. And we saw a lot of those outputs were then difficult to parse out and comprehended by women who, A, were not very comfortable with the formal jargon that was used in the chatbots, or were simply uncomfortable with the level of language and proficiency that was used by the chatbot. Now, what we did, sorry for skipping through so quickly, but what we did was, based on these findings, we came up with a few recommendations and future pathways for making LLM applications more gender equitable. But rather than, I think, getting into those, just in the interest of time, I can perhaps just share the idea that underpinned some of these recommendations. Now, one key concern was the techno-solutionist framing of large language models, where currently in India, at least starting from 2023 to late 2024, there is a lot of excitement around using LLMs and AI in general to plug a lot of critical service delivery gaps, right? And it almost seems to be coming at the opportunity cost of investments that can perhaps go into physical infrastructure, that can go into improving the capacity of frontline healthcare cadre, for instance, right? So there is a very real opportunity cost associated with building LLMs. And if we have to do it right, we need perhaps a more patient kind of capital. We need more community engagements, and we need to also lessen the distance between LLM developers and the communities they kind of target. And of course, this kind of work is slow, it's expensive, and it really can't be done with piecemeal grants from philanthropies, for instance, right? We need a lot of institutionalized frameworks to ensure that LLMs are gender equitable. I'll pause here. Thank you.
Well, it's like our speaker.